Okay, welcome to session 3. This session is going to be all about answering the question, who were the Israelites? So these people that we've been talking about who've written all these texts, who are they? How do we know about them? What can we tell about them? So to get to know the people of the Hebrew Bible, it's going to be useful to think about their origins. So what was their surrounding culture like? What were their neighbouring people groups like? Where did they come from? Where did they live? So a brief overview of the origins that have been identified for the Israelites is going to help to provide some possible answers to these questions, as well as set the scene for our kind of later learning around their customs and their culture. And the first thing to note about them is that they were one group among many. Reading the Hebrew Bible can make it seem like the Israelites were a big and significant group in many respects. And to an extent, that's true after the establishment of their kingdom. But it wasn't always the case. See, the group that became known as the Israelites began life, it's more than likely, as a small nomadic tribe. Now, other major powers had existed long before Abraham's group came onto the scene, so the Egyptians, the Sumerians, the Akkadians. And these civilizations had their own cultures and mythological frameworks, including origins for the world and stories about a great flood. Now, the religious makeup of these cultures was polytheistic, and stories of multiple gods would have been in regular circulation. And polytheism, the belief in a whole pantheon of gods who have different functions and what have you within their religious life. Now, beyond their immediate surroundings, cultures further afield were telling stories about the universe and its spiritual realm. In fact, even Britain was doing this way before the Israelites were on the scene. So what about Abraham's group? Well, Abraham, if he were a real person and not just a character in a story, likely would have belonged to a nomadic group of travellers. And in rough seasons, they would have sought shelter from Egypt. And some may have chosen to settle down in cities, so somebody like Lot did that. And the unusual mark of Abraham's group was their belief in only one God. And although some of their stories of the origins of the world closely pattern those of their neighbours, the Israelite stories are distinctive in their insistence, or apparent insistence, that one God alone performed the action of creation. And we'll learn more about that later on in the module as we kind of compare their stories to some of the surrounding literature that's been discovered. Now, of course, the name Israel doesn't appear until the time of Jacob, when he's given that name and its meaning, which is champion of El being a name for God. And Jacob is one of the defining characters in the origins of Israel as a people group. Not only is his name where their cultural identity is found, but his 12 sons became the basis for the 12 tribes around which their social order was structured. Now, fast forward slightly, and the story of Moses takes centre stage. Now, whether or not Moses was a real historical figure is pretty widely disputed. The only mentions we have of Moses are from the Jewish tradition. The Exodus from Egypt is verified by biblical tradition alone. It received no mention in any Egyptian traditions. Even mention of a mass revolt of Hebrew slaves is nowhere to be found. So it's more likely that the Hebrew slaves gradually left and settled in the wilderness. And Moses is most likely the legendary folkloric spearhead of the kind of Israelite tradition. In fact, the story of Moses actually reads more like folklore, and more like a folktale than it does like a historical narrative or a historical record. And as we progress through the module, we'll see kind of how story forms an important part of Israel's national identity and self-understanding. But the Israelites kind of make attempts at taking the promised land. And in this narrative, a blessing is said over them by Balaam, who, as Calm points out, kind of reflects the opinion prevailing in the ancient world that the Israelites were not so much a nation as a people with a distinctive religious identity. As they begin to settle in the promised land after Moses' death, taking over various cultures, their numbers and influence grew until they became a kingdom in their own right, as we saw in the overview last lecture. And they went from nomads to kings, taking in a variety of cultures and establishing an identity that was both reflective of and distinctive from their own. So what I'm hoping you can see here is that the question, who were the Israelites, isn't a simple sort of, they were this particular group of people. They had a developing identity. They came into being over a period of time. And what we'll find as we look at their literature and we try and get behind their cultural practices and their religious practices is that develops with them. They didn't sort of come set in stone and have everything figured out. Everything is kind of an ongoing process of figuring out who they are as a people and how they relate to the God of the universe. So, I'll see you in the next lecture. I hope this has been kind of enlightening in some ways. Get on with the reading tasks and the questions, and I'll see you then.